Welcome to Ash and Iron, where we dig through the ashes of history to find the iron truth beneath. Today we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating aspects of the Crusades, the military religious orders that defined medieval warfare and shaped the course of history for centuries. These weren't just soldiers and they weren't just monks. They were something entirely new, a revolutionary fusion of spiritual devotion and martial prowess that had never existed before and would never quite exist again in the same way. The Knights Templar. The Templars were founded around 1119 by a small group of knights led by Hugh de Payens, a nobleman from the Champagne region of France. The traditional account, found in the Chronicle of William of Tyre, tells us that Hugh and 8 companions approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. They would dedicate themselves to protecting Christian pilgrims on the dangerous roads of the Holy Land, particularly the route from the port of Jaffa to Jerusalem. The First Crusade had made pilgrimage to the Holy Land possible for Western European Christians in a way it hadn't been for centuries. Thousands were making the journey, but the roads were perilous. Bandits operated freely in the hills and deserts, and pilgrims, often traveling in small group, unarmed, carrying their life savings to pay for the journey, were ideal targets. These weren't just robberies. Pilgrims were murdered, sometimes by the hundreds. Their bodies were left to rot by the roadside, their goods stolen, their quest to visit the holy sites ending in violence and death. Hugh's small band of knights offered a solution. They would patrol these roads, provide armed escorts for pilgrim caravans, and hunt down the bandit who preyed on the faithful. It was a dangerous mission that required permanent commitment. You couldn't protect pilgrims year-round if you were only in the Holy Land for a fighting season and then returned to your estates in Europe. King Baldwin was enthusiastic about the proposal and gave the knights quarters in the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. This building, which the Crusaders believed to be built on the ruins of Solomon's Temple, gave the order its name and its mystique. Imagine the symbolic power of that location, knights living in what they thought was the holiest site in Jerusalem, the very temple where Christ himself had walked. For the first 9 years of their existence, the Templars remained a small organization. Hugh and his companions lived simply, relying on donations and alms. They adopted the white mantle as their symbol of purity, though the famous Red Cross would be added a day. They took monastic vows and lived according to a rule, though at this stage it was informal. Everything changed in 1129 when Hugh de Payens traveled to Europe to seek official recognition from the Church. At the Council of Troyes in Champagne, convened by Pope Honorius II, the Templar order received formal papal approval. Even more importantly, Bernard of Clairvaux, the most influential churchman of his age, was commissioned to write the order's official rule. His endorsement of the Templars gave them instant legitimacy and prestige. The rule of the Templars that Bernard helped create was based on the Cistercian route adapted for warriors. It specified every aspect of Templar life in meticulous detail. The rule also established the order's hierarchy. At the top was the Grand Master, elected for life by the Chapter of Knights. Below him were various officers: the Seneschal, who was second in command, the Marshal, who commanded the order's military forces, the Commander of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Draper, who was responsible for clothing, the Turcopolier, who commanded the native light cavalry employed by the order. There were regional commanders for the order's holdings in different parts of Europe and the Middle East. The knights themselves, the fully professed warrior brothers who wore the white mantle, were only a portion of the order's membership. They had to be of noble birth, proven in combat, and willing to take the 3 monastic vows. Below them were the sergeants, who wore brown or black mantles and served as lighter cavalry or infantry. There were also chaplains, who were ordained priests responsible for the spiritual life of the order, and a large staff of support personnel: craftsmen, farmers, servants, laborers. But Bernard didn't just give the Templars a rule, he also wrote a treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood that provided the theological justification for the warrior monk. This document is fascinating because it explicitly contrasts the Templar with the secular knight. The The secular knight, Bernard argues, is motivated by pride and greed. He adorns himself with silks and jewelry. He fights for glory and plunder. He sins in the very act of combat. But the Templar is pure. He fights not for himself, but for Christ. He seeks no personal gain. If he kills, it is not murder, but malicide, the destruction of evil. And if he dies in battle, he achieves martyrdom and goes straight to heaven. This was powerful stuff, and it worked. Donations poured in. Noble families gave the Templars land, castles, money, trading rights. Within a few decades, the order had gone from 9 knights sharing quarters in Jerusalem to an international organization with thousands of members and properties across Europe and the Middle East. The Templars' military role evolved rapidly as well. They were no longer just protecting pilgrims on roads. They became the standing army of the Crusader states, manning frontier fortresses, providing the disciplined core of Christian armies, conducting reconnaissance and raids deep into enemy territory. Unlike secular knights who might serve for a season and then go home, unlike local barons who might be distracted by political rivalries and personal ambitions, the Templars were always there, always ready, always professional. Their most important military contribution was probably their castles. The Templars built and maintained some of the most formidable fortifications ever constructed. Castle Pilgrim on the coast south of Haifa had walls so thick that even the most powerful siege engines of the age couldn't breach them. Safed Galilee could house a garrison of 1,700 men. Tortosa on the coast of Syria was never taken by force. These weren't just military installations. They were administrative centers, warehouses, refuges for Christian populations during Muslim raids. The Templars' reputation was truly forged on the battlefield. They were renowned for their discipline, their courage bordering on recklessness, and their absolute refusal to retreat or surrender. The Templar rule actually forbade a knight from leaving the battlefield unless the order's banner fell, and even then only to regroup around another Christian banner. They could not ask for mercy or ransom if captured. They were to fight to the death. The Templars were also pioneers in what we might call special operations. They conducted deep reconnaissance into enemy territory, sometimes disguised as Muslims, speaking Arabic, their beards grown long in the Eastern style. They gathered intelligence on enemy movements, terrain, water sources. They conducted raids and ambushes. They were in many ways the special forces of the Crusader states. Their intelligence network was legendary. The Templars maintained informants throughout the Muslim world, often Arabic-speaking Christians or converts who could move freely in Muslim territories. This intelligence was so valuable that Muslim leaders sometimes tried to plant false information, knowing the Templars would report it to the Christian king. But the Templars were more than just warriors. They developed into a financial powerhouse that revolutionized medieval banking. While the Templars are the most famous military order, the Knights Hospitaller, formerly the Order of Knights of the Hospital of St. John of Jerusalem, actually have the distinction of being the oldest. They predate the Templars by several decades, and unlike the Templars, they still exist today as the sovereign military order of Malta, making them the world's oldest continuously functioning international organization. The Hospitaller's origins are distinctly unmilitary. Their story begins in the mid-11th century, likely around 1048 to 1060, before the First Crusade even happened. Merchants from the Italian city-state of Amalfi obtained permission from the Fatimid Caliph to establish a hospital in Jerusalem to care for sick and injured Christian pilgrims. Some sources place this as early as 1048, others closer to 1060. The exact date is debated by historians. This hospital was dedicated to St. John the Baptist, hence the order's name. It was staffed by Benedictine monks who took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and devoted themselves to caring for the poor and sick. The phrase, "the sick are our lords," became central to Hospitaller identity. When the First Crusade captured Jerusalem in 1099, the hospital's work became even more important. Thousands of pilgrims were now flooding into the Holy Land, many of them falling ill from diseases they had no immunity to, injured from the perils of travel, or simply exhausted from the journey. The Hospitallers expanded rapidly, establishing a network of hospitals and hospices throughout the Crusader states. The monk who transformed the Hospitallers from a charitable organization into a military order was Gerard, often called Blessed Gerard, who was the hospital's superior at the time of the First Crusade. However, it was under his successor, Raymond Dupuy, who led the order from approximately 1120 to 1160, that the military transformation truly took hold. Raymond recognized the same problem that had led to the founding of the Templars. The Crusader states desperately needed permanent, reliable military forces, but he also recognized that the Hospitallers had something the Templars lacked: an established infrastructure, significant income from donations, and a reputation for piety and service. Under Raymond's leadership, the Hospitallers began accepting knights as brothers and started taking on military responsibilities. Based on the evidence we have, this militarization appears to have occurred sometime in the 1130s and 1140s. By the 1140s, they were garrisoning castles and fighting alongside the Templars in major battles. But here's what's fascinating. They never abandoned their Hospitaller mission. Even as they became fierce warriors, they continued operating hospitals and caring for the sick. A Hospitaller knight might spend his morning fighting Muslims and his afternoon washing the feet of sick pilgrims. This dual identity, warrior and healer, distinguished them from the Templars and gave them a unique character. The Hospitaller rule, based on the Augustinian rather than Cistercian model, reflected this dual nature. It specified in great detail how the hospitals should be run. Each patient was to be examined by a doctor upon admission. They were to receive fresh, clean bedding and nightshirts. Their diet was to be generous meat 3 times per week for those who could digest it, and careful attention paid to individual needs. Women about to give birth were given special care. The sick were to be treated with patience and kindness as our lords. The main Hospitaller hospital in Jerusalem could house up to 2,000 patients at its peak. It had its own pharmacy, gardens for growing medicinal herbs, and a staff of hundreds. Pilgrims spoke of it with awe. One chronicler wrote that nowhere in the Christian world was such generous care provided to the sick and poor. But the Hospitallers were also formidable warriors. Like the Templars, they wore distinctive clothing. Initially a black surcoat with a white cross, though this would later change. Their military organization was similar to the Templars, with knights of noble birth forming the cavalry, sergeants providing lighter troops, and various support personnel. They built and maintained massive castles, and they fought with the same fanatical courage that characterized the Templars. The greatest of the Hospitaller castles was undoubtedly Crac de Chevalier in Syria. Crac, from the Syriac word garak, meaning fortress, was originally a small Muslim fortification. The Emir of Homs gave it to the Count of Tripoli around 1110, but it was the Hospitallers who transformed it into perhaps the finest medieval castle ever built. Beginning in the 1140s and continuing through the 13th century, they constructed a massive concentric fortress that could house a garrison of 2,000 men and withstand virtually any siege. The castle is a masterpiece of military architecture. It has 2 massive concentric walls, studded with towers that allow defenders to pour fire on attackers from multiple angles. The inner citadel sits on a glacis, a steep artificial slope faced with smooth stone that makes scaling impossible and causes siege equipment to bounce harmlessly away. There are multiple baileys and courtyards that attackers would have to fight through even if they breached the outer wall. The castle had its own wells, massive storage rooms that could hold supplies for years, a chapel, baths, dormitories, and all the facilities of a small city. Crac's strategic position was just as important as its fortifications. It sat on a hill controlling the Homs Gap, the only major route between the coast and the interior of Syria. From Crac, the Hospitallers could launch raids deep into Muslim territory, gather intelligence, and block any Muslim army trying to reach the coast. Faladin besieged it briefly in 1188. It gave up without seriously attempting to take it. He understood it was practically impregnable. The castle only fell in 1271, and even then it took the Mamluk Sultan Baybars, perhaps the greatest Muslim military leader of the crusading era. A month of intense siege warfare. Even then he couldn't breach the walls. According to the traditional account, he had to use trickery, forging a letter supposedly from the Hospitaller Grand Master, ordering the garrison to surrender. The stratagem worked, and the Hospitallers marched out with honor, though modern historians debate whether this story is entirely accurate or embellished. Regardless, the fact that Baibars needed such tactics speaks to the castle's strength. In battle, the Hospitallers were every bit as fierce as the Templars. At the disastrous Battle of Hattin in 1187, where Saladin destroyed the field army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem and paved the way for his reconquest of the city, both the Templar and Hospitaller contingents fought to annihilation. Saladin offered to spare the lives of the military orders if they would convert to Islam. They refused to a man, and Saladin had them execute. But the Hospitallers could also be pragmatic in ways the Templars sometimes weren't. They developed sophisticated diplomatic relationships with Muslim powers, sometimes paying tribute, sometimes forming temporary alliances. They understood that survival in Outremer required more than just military prowess. It required political skill, intelligence gathering, and the ability to exploit divisions among their enemies. After the fall of Acre and the end of the Crusader states in 1291, the Hospitallers faced the same existential question as the Templars. What was their purpose now? Their answer was radically different. Rather than drift into irrelevance, they would conquer their own territory and continue the fight from there. The third of the great international military orders emerged later than the Templars and Hospitallers, but carved out a unique and controversial legacy. The Order of Brothers of the German House of St. Mary in Jerusalem. The Teutonic Knights would shift the very geography of the Crusades from the Holy Land to the forests and marshes of northeastern Europe, where they waged a brutal war of conquest and conversion that created the foundations of modern Germany and shaped Eastern European history for centuries. The Teutonic Order began, like the Hospitallers, as a hospitaller organization. During the Siege of Acre in 1190, some German merchants established a field hospital to care for sick and wounded German Crusaders. This was a practical response to language barriers. German soldiers couldn't communicate effectively with the Hospitallers or Templars, who conducted their business primarily in French or Latin. In 1198, this hospital was formalized into a religious order approved by Pope Celestine III. The transformation into a military order came quickly. By 1201, the Teutonic Knights had adopted a mixed rule: the Templar rule for military affairs and the Hospitaller rule for their hospitals, and were accepting knights as members. They wore white mantles like the Templars, but with a black cross instead of red. They were explicitly German in character, requiring members to be of German birth or descent, which distinguished them from the international Templars and Hospitallers. In the Holy Land, the Teutonic Knights operated similarly to the other military orders, though on a smaller scale. They held some important castles, including Montfort in Galilee, which served as their headquarters. They fought in major battles. They provided hospital services, but they never achieved the power or prestige of the Templars and Hospitallers in Outremer. There simply wasn't enough space for three major military orders competing for the same limited resources and glory. The order's destiny changed dramatically in 1226, when Grand Master Hermann von Salza received a request from Duke Conrad of Masovia in Poland. Conrad was struggling with a persistent problem: raids by the pagan Prussians, a Baltic people who lived along the southern and eastern shores of the Baltic Sea. These weren't just minor incursions. The Prussians were fierce warriors who conducted slave raids, burned settlements, and generally made life miserable for Christian Poland's northern frontier. Conrad offered the Teutonic Knights a deal that would reshape European history. Come to Prussia, subjugate the pagans, Christianize them, and you can keep whatever territory you conquer. It was an extraordinary offer, and Hermann von Salza, a brilliant political operator, made sure to get it confirmed in writing, not just by Conrad, but by the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. He wanted no ambiguity about the order's rights to any conquered territory. The first Teutonic Knights arrived in Prussia in 1230. What followed was one of the most ruthlessly efficient conquest campaigns in medieval history. This wasn't a crusade in the traditional sense, with a large army marching to liberate territory and then going home. This was systematic conquest and colonization. The Teutonic Knights built castles, established bases, imported German settlers, and waged a relentless war against the Prussian tribe. The Prussians fought back fiercely. They knew their lands, their forests and swamps and rivers. They were skilled warriors who used guerrilla tactics. They destroyed German settlements, ambushed Teutonic patrols, and inflicted heavy casualties. The conquest took over 50 years of brutal warfare, rebellion, and reconquest. But the Teutonic Knights had several advantages the Prussians couldn't overcome. First, they could draw on a steady stream of recruits and reinforcements from Germany. The Baltic Crusades were officially sanctioned by the Church, offering the same spiritual benefits as crusading in the Holy Land. German nobles sent their sons to fight. Merchants provided funding. The order could replace its losses. The Prussians couldn't. Second, the Teutonic Knights were master castle builders. They constructed a network of fortifications across Prussia, massive brick castles that served as administrative centers, military bases, and refuges for German colonists. Marienburg, which became the order's headquarters after 1281, was one of the largest castles in the world. A sprawling complex of walls, towers, halls, and churches that could house thousands of people. These castles were practically impossible for the Prussians, who lacked siege equipment and engineering expertise, to capture. Third, the order pursued a deliberate policy of cultural destruction and replacement. Prussian nobles who converted to Christianity were allowed to keep their lands and status. Those who resisted were killed or enslaved. Prussian religious sites were destroyed and replaced with Christian churches. German settlers were encouraged to move to Prussia, bringing German language, laws, and customs. The Prussian language and culture were systematically suppressed. By 1383, the conquest was complete. Prussia was now a Teutonic state, ruled by the order's Grand Master from Marienburg. It was an extraordinary achievement. Another set of military orders emerged on the Iberian Peninsula to fight in what Spaniards called the Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain and Portugal from Muslim rule. The Order of Santiago was the largest, wealthiest, and most influential. St. James in English was founded around 1170 in the Kingdom of Leon by a group of knights dedicated to protecting pilgrims on the Camino de Santiago, the pilgrimage route to the shrine of St. James at Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain. This should sound familiar. It's essentially the same mission that inspired the Templars, but in a different context. What made Santiago and the other Iberian military orders unique was that they were fighting a different kind of crusade. The Reconquista wasn't about liberating foreign territory or protecting distant holy sites. It was about taking back land that had been Christian for centuries before the Muslim conquest in the early 8th century. It was closer to a civil war or reconquest than a foreign crusade, though it certainly had religious dimension. The Muslim states of Iberia, collectively called Al-Andalus, were sophisticated, wealthy, and powerful. Cities like Cordoba, Seville, and Granada were centers of learning, art, and commerce that rivaled or surpassed anything in Christian Europe. The Muslim military forces were formidable, including heavily armored cavalry, light horse archers, and disciplined infantry. The frontier between Christian and Muslim Spain was fluid, with territory changing hands frequently, and both sides conducted raids and counter-raids in an endless cycle of violence. The Order of Santiago received official papal approval in 1175 and quickly grew into a major power. Unlike the international orders, Santiago recruited primarily from Spanish nobility and developed a distinctly Spanish character. Their symbol was a red cross shaped like a sword, Cross of St. James, which they wore on white mantles. This martial symbol reflected their primary mission, fighting Muslims.
Santiago differed from the Templars and Hospitallers in another crucial way. They allowed their knights to marry.
This was controversial and required special papal dispensation, but it was practical. Spanish nobles were less willing to take permanent vows of celibacy, and the order needed to attract large numbers of recruits. Married knights lived with their families in the order's commanderies, and their children could inherit property, though they couldn't automatically inherit their father's position in the order. The order built an extensive network of castles along the frontier with Muslim territories. These weren't just military installations, they were administrative centers for vast estates. Santiago became extraordinarily wealthy through land grants from grateful monarchs. At its peak, the order controlled huge swaths of territory in Leon, Castile, Portugal, and Aragon. They owned entire towns, thousands of villages, extensive agricultural lands, mines, and commercial operations. The Grand Master of Santiago was one of the most powerful men in Spain, commanding resources that rivaled many kings.
The Santiago Knights fought in all the major battles of the Reconquista.
At Las Navas de Tolosa in 1212, the decisive battle that broke Muslim power in central Spain, Santiago Knights formed a crucial part of the Christian army. The Grand Master of Santiago, Pedro Arias, died heroically in the battle, but the Christian victory was complete. The Muslim Almohad Caliphate suffered catastrophic losses, and the balance of power in Iberia shifted permanently in favor of the Christian kingdom. The order also played a key role in the conquest of Muslim territories. When a city or region was captured, Santiago would often receive grants of land and castles there. They would then administer these territories, bringing in Christian settlers, building churches, establishing markets. In this way, they were instrumental in the Christianization and Castilianization of conquered regions. But Santiago wasn't just about warfare. Like the Hospitallers, they maintained hospitals and hospices, particularly along the pilgrimage routes. They ran schools and orphanages. They provided charity to the poor. The rule of Santiago required members to give alms and care for the sick. There were warrior monks, but they took the monk path seriously. The order's political role was also significant. Grand Masters of Santiago were major political players, often serving as advisors to kings, leading diplomatic missions and wielding influence at court. They could field private armies numbering in the thousands. This made them valuable allies but also potential threats to royal authority. Several Spanish monarchs clashed with Santiago over questions of jurisdiction and power. After the fall of Granada in 1492, the last Muslim state in Iberia, the Reconquista, was essentially over. Santiago, like the other military orders, faced questions about its continued purpose. The Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, saw the orders as potential rivals and sought to bring them under royal control. In 1493, Pope Alexander VI granted Ferdinand the administration of the military orders, effectively making him their head. This began a process of secularization that would gradually transform Santiago from an independent military order into an honorary institution controlled by the Spanish crown.
Santiago continued to exist as an order of knighthood,
And membership remained prestigious. The order's extensive properties were eventually absorbed by the Spanish state. The Order of Calatrava holds the distinction of being the first military order founded specifically for the Reconquista. Their story is one of desperate need, unlikely heroes, and eventual transformation into a power that rivaled Santiago itself. In 1158, the city of Calatrava, strategically vital because it controlled the main route from Muslim territory to Toledo, was under threat. The Almohads, a fundamentalist Muslim dynasty from North Africa, were advancing north, and the Templars, who had been garrisoning Calatrava, felt they couldn't hold it. They abandoned the city and returned the charter to King Sancho III of Castile. This was a crisis. If Calatrava fell, Toledo itself, the ancient Visigothic capital recently reconquered by Christians, would be vulnerable. But who could defend it? Into this crisis stepped an unlikely figure, Diego Velázquez, a Cistercian monk serving as abbot of a monastery in Navarre. Diego, despite being a monk with no military training, volunteered to take over the defense of Calatrava with the help of his fellow monks and any knights willing to join them. This seemed audacious, to put it mildly. Monks defending a frontier fortress? But Diego had a vision. He would create a new kind of military order, one based on the Cistercian rule like the Templars, but dedicated specifically to the defense of Castile against the Muslims. King Sancho, having no better options, agreed. In 1158, the Order of Calatrava was born. Against odds, Diego's strategy worked. The Almohads didn't attack immediately, giving Diego time to recruit knights and fortify the city. The order attracted members, some from religious conviction, others from the promise of land and plunder, many from a mix of both. They established a system where knights would serve for specified periods and then return to their homes, while a core group of brother knights took permanent vows. The Order of Calatrava received papal approval in 1164 and quickly expanded. Like Santiago, they allowed knights to marry, though with some restrictions. They wore white habits with a red cross, red for the blood of martyrdom they were willing to shed. They built a network of castles and commanderies across Castile, establishing a military and economic power base. Calatrava knights fought in all the major campaigns of the Reconquista. They were particularly active in the conquest of Andalusia, receiving grants of territory as rewards for their service. They participated in the Battle of Las Navas de Tolosa, where their Grand Master, Ruy Diaz de Yanguas, led the order's contingent alongside Santiago and the other military orders in the decisive Christian victory. The order's wealth grew enormously through land grants and conquests. They controlled vast agricultural estates, sheep herds numbering in the tens of thousands, towns and villages. The Grand Master of Calatrava was one of the most powerful nobles in Castile, commanding private armies and administering territories the size of small kingdoms. Like Santiago, Calatrava became increasingly political over time. Grand Masters were major power brokers, sometimes supporting kings, sometimes opposing them. The order was involved in several civil wars and succession disputes in medieval Castile, fielding armies for their favored candidates. This political involvement brought wealth and power, but also made the order vulnerable to royal backlash when they backed the wrong side. The Catholic monarchs brought Calatrava under royal control in the late 15th century, following the same pattern as with Santiago. The order was transformed from an independent institution into a royally controlled organization. Its military function ended, though it continued to exist as an honor, conferring knighthood on worthy nobles. The Order of Alcántara was another Spanish military order that emerged from the Reconquista. The Order of Alcántara was another Spanish military order that emerged from the Reconquista, though its origins are somewhat different from Santiago and Calatrava. Founded around 1156 as the Order of San Julián del Perero, it was originally a small organization dedicated to defending a specific region on the Portuguese-Leon border. In 1118, the order received a grant of the town of Alcántara from King Alfonso IX of Leon. Alcántara was strategically important, controlling a bridge over the Tagus River on the frontier with Muslim territory. The order took the town's name and made it their headquarters, transforming from a regional organization into a major military order. Like Calatrava, Alcántara followed the Cistercian rule and wore white habits, though their cross was green rather than red and green, representing hope. They allowed married knights, recruited primarily from Spanish nobility, and served as a frontier force defending Christian territory and conducting raids into Muslim lands. Alcántara participated in the major campaigns of the Reconquista, but they never quite achieved the size and wealth of Santiago or Calatrava. They fought at Las Navas de Tolosa and participated in the conquest of Extremadura and Andalus. They received substantial land grants and built an impressive network of castles and estates. The order's political importance grew in the 14th and 15th centuries as Grand Masters became major players in the power struggles of the Castilian nobility. They commanded significant private armies and controlled strategic territory along the Portuguese border. Like the other Spanish orders, Alcántara was eventually brought under royal control by Ferdinand and Isabella, ending its independence. The Order of Montesa has a unique origin story among the military orders. It was founded specifically to replace the Templars after their suppression. When Pope Clement V dissolved the Templar Order in 1312, there was the question of what to do with their extensive properties, particularly in the Kingdom of Aragon, where the persecution had been less severe than in France. King James II of Aragon petitioned the Pope to create a new military order that would receive the Templar properties in his kingdom and continue the fight against the Muslims in Valencia, where the frontier was still active. In 1319, Pope John XXII approved the creation of the Order of Montesa, named after the castle of Montesa in Valencia that became its headquarters. Montesa was modeled, or Calatrava, and followed the Cistercian rule. The first members were former Templars and Hospitallers who transferred their allegiance to the new order. They wore white mantles with a red cross, and like the other Spanish orders, they allowed married knights. Montesa never achieved the size or wealth of the older Spanish orders, but they served an important function defending the Valencian frontier. They held strategic castles, conducted raids, and fought in the ongoing conflicts with the Muslim Kingdom of Granada. They also fought against Barbary pirates who raided the Valencian coast, developing naval capabilities unusual for a Spanish military order. The Order of Aviz was Portugal's most important military order. Founded in 1143 as a branch of Calatrava, Aviz initially focused on defending the Portuguese frontier with Muslim-controlled territories to the south. The order received the town of Aviz from King Afonso Henriques and established their headquarters there. They wore white habits with a green cross, the same color as Alcántara, with whom they had close ties. They followed the Cistercian rule and allowed married knights. Aviz participated actively in the Portuguese Reconquista, fighting in the conquest of the Algarve and receiving extensive land grants in the conquered territories. They built castles, established settlements, and administered vast states. The Grand Master of Aviz became one of the most powerful nobles in Portugal. The order's greatest moment came in 1385, when the Grand Master John of Aviz became King John I of Portugal. This happened during a succession crisis following the death of King Ferdinand I without male heirs. John of Aviz, who was the illegitimate son of the previous King Pedro I, was elected king by the Cortes. He defeated Castilian attempts to claim the Portuguese throne at the Battle of Aljubarrota in 1385, securing Portuguese independence. As king, John of Aviz founded the Aviz dynasty, which would rule Portugal until 1580. The military order of Aviz was transformed from a religious organization into a royal order of knighthood, though it retained some of its religious character. The order became essentially a Portuguese royal order, conferring knighthood as an honor and mark of royal favor. When the Templars were suppressed in 1312, the Portuguese King Denis I didn't want to see the order's properties and capabilities wasted. With papal approval, he founded the Order of Christ in 1319 to receive the Templar holdings in Portugal and continue their mission. The Order of Christ was explicitly designed as the Templar successor. Many of its first members were former Templars. It took over Templar castles, estates, and responsibilities. The order's symbol was a modified Templar cross, a white cross on a red one, symbolizing their connection to and succession from the suppressed order. Unlike most military orders, the Order of Christ would play a crucial role not in crusading warfare, but in Portugal's age of exploration. The order became enormously wealthy through trade and land holdings. Prince Henry the Navigator, who sponsored Portuguese exploration in the 15th century, was the order's Grand Master. The order helped finance many of the Portuguese voyages of discovery, and their cross sailed on Portuguese ships to Africa, India, and eventually Brazil. Vasco da Gama, who discovered the sea route to India, was a knight of the Order of Christ. The order's cross flew on Portuguese ships throughout the Age of Discovery, making it perhaps the most widely traveled symbol of any military order. In a sense, the Order of Christ transformed crusading from a land-based warfare in the Mediterranean to a maritime expansion across the entire world. The order was secularized in 1551, transformed into an honorary order of knighthood controlled by the Portuguese crown. The smaller orders. The Order of St. Lazarus was founded in the mid-12th century specifically to care for crusaders afflicted with leprosy. Leper knights, nobles who had contracted the disease but still wished to serve, could join this order and continue fighting despite their affliction. They wore green crosses and operated a hospital in Jerusalem. The Order of St. Thomas of Acre, also called the Knights of St. Thomas, was founded by Richard I of England during the Third Crusade. It was modeled the Teutonic Knights as a specifically English military order. They never achieved great size or wealth, but they maintained a presence in the Holy Land until the fall of Acca and then relocated to England. The Order of Dublin was a short-lived military order founded in 1228 by Duke Conrad of Masovia, the same duke who would later invite the Teutonic Knights to Prussia. Britain was meant to defend against Prussian raids, but the order was small and poorly funded. It was eventually absorbed into the Teutonic Order in 1235, though some members transferred to the Templars or Hospitallers instead. The Livonian Brothers of the Sword were founded in 1198 to crusade in Livonia, modern Latvia and Estonia. They were effective warriors, but suffered from poor leadership and overextension. After their catastrophic defeat at Saul in 1236, where they lost their Grand Master and a third of their knights, they merged with the Teutonic Order, becoming the Livonian branch of that larger organization. From the Leper Knights of St. Lazarus continuing to serve despite their affliction, to the English Knights of St. Thomas maintaining a national military order, to the short-lived, determined efforts of the Dublin Knights, these smaller orders remind us that the crusading movement was far more diverse and complex than the famous orders alone would suggest. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Ash and Iron for more deep dives into medieval history and the warrior monks who shaped the world. What lesser-known military order would you like to learn more about? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, this is Ash and Iron.